Hello, we are reading through the book of Zechariah this week. Excuse me. And today we're in chapters 5 and 6. Now, you probably know that in the life of God's people, especially in the Old Testament, there were some key leadership positions that God had established in order to help his people grow and flourish as he intended. One of the key leadership positions was that of a king. It was the king's job to rule over God's people, to rule over the political, the economic, and the social dimensions of their life together in such a way that the people flourished and God was glorified. One of the other key leadership roles was that of a priest. Now, the priest's job was to lead the spiritual and religious dimensions of the life of God's people. And so the priest would minister to God on behalf of the people, and the priest would minister to the people on behalf of God. Kings and priests, two super significant leadership roles designed to help the people flourish. Now, in all the history of God's people, the kings and the priests were always separate people. There was never a king who was also a priest, and there was never a priest who was also a king. But interestingly, in the passage today in Zechariah chapter 6, these two leadership roles are fused together into one person. In Zechariah chapter 6, Zechariah is told to make a crown and place it on the head of a man named Joshua as a sort of prophetic, symbolic act, if you like. And this is what it says. Zechariah 6, verse 11. Make a crown, set it on the head of Joshua. Verse 12. And say to him, thus says the Lord of hosts, behold the man whose name is the branch, for he shall branch out from this place, and he shall build the temple of the Lord. It is he who shall build the temple of the Lord, and shall bear royal honor, and shall sit and rule on his throne. And there shall be a priest on his throne, and the council of peace shall be between them both. Zechariah talks about a time when a person will rule like a king and lead like a priest at the very same time. This had never happened before in the history of God's people. These two roles had never been fused together, but here Zechariah seems to be speaking of a time when the king and the priest would be one person. Of course, you probably know that the ultimate fulfillment of Zechariah's prophetic, symbolic act here is Jesus. Jesus is the perfect king priest. He's the one who rules over God's kingdom with perfect justice and righteousness and integrity and power. But he's also the great high priest who leads God's people in their worship and in their relationship with God. He is the perfect king, and he is the perfect priest. He is the king priest. It's just one example of how even in the Old Testament, Jesus is everywhere. You know, Jesus is everywhere. The whole of the story of God's people, every prophetic word, every prophetic symbolic act is all pointing us forward to the perfect embodiment of all that God is and all of God's purposes and plans. It is Jesus. Jesus is the center of everything. Jesus is the fulfillment of all things. And this is just one example of that as well. So, I hope that's been helpful. See you again tomorrow for our final reading together in Zechariah.